welcome everyone. My name is Darren Calhoun. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm glad you're with us tonight for the Q Christian Fellowship Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Gathering. I'm part of the team that works to make sure that equity, inclusion, and diversity and belonging are a deep part of who we are as Q Christian Fellowship, and to make sure that it's a part of how we show up as community. This is core to who we are, how we gather. So, in this space, on the first Sundays of the month, we gather to learn how we live into that commitment. We come together to reflect, to learn, and to be stretched as we dive into conversations that matter. Tonight, we've got a rich and layered journey ahead of us. We're diving into intimate paths, relationship expressions across Western Christian history. Now, as you know, that's a mouthful, and it does sound like a seminary lecture title, but it's got a lot of depth and heart. And this is about how Christians have loved, partnered, and regulated intimacy for probably the past 2,000 years. We just like to create the space to better understand how we got here and how we can think critically about where we're going as people of faith.
Today, we're going to be talking through some history to expand our understanding of how socio-political and theological norms differ over time and across cultural contexts. And we're doing this so that we can connect our own values and faith expressions today in our current cultural context. And we invite you to consider we are here now in these times and places and varied cultural contexts. I mean, clearly, Zimbabwe to New Zealand. We have people from all over the United States as well. And so we might ask, how did we get here? And then we might consider, where do we go from here? And some of our framing from my perspective is related to what we call kingdom theology, which is kind of a switch up on how many traditions talk about kingdom theology. And so we're kind of resisting this idea of the historic, male dominated king worlds and focusing on our community, just as we do with QCF, community and kin. We think about those differently. And so we use the idea of kingdom theology to think about this idea of how Jesus, is initiating God's commonwealth for human flourishing. And we want to bring future values into the present reality instead of thinking, looking back for kind of some prescriptive idea. We're looking forward to help shape our values. And that's this idea of the now and the not yet. Jesus has initiated, inaugurated this kingdom, this community that we have, and yet it is still not fully manifested in the world today. Now, when we think about the future, a term that you might hear as Gordon talks a little bit more is this idea of eschatology. And eschatology concerns the expectations of the end of the present age of human history or the world as we know it. And beliefs about a new heaven and a new earth include imagining new relationship forms. Now, when we look back into the Gospels, the institution of marriage at that time, as it was known at the time of Jesus, and likely as it is now, is not necessarily a part of this ultimate future with God, this heaven, afterlife, resurrection, the new heavens and the new earth, though they're parousia. And we see that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I can share those references with you in the chat later. But when we think about our values, we might want to consider, how are we holding on to an ideal imagined past? And in what ways might we imagine new futures informed by kingdom values? And so we live in this tension of bringing values we hope for the future into the present, and yet we have to think about the past and the influences of the past and how they've influenced where we are now. And so we're going to go through some key concepts to kind of frame our discussion of these historical kind of periods and the ways that relationships were formed and also became norms, became the normal way of being in various places and various times. And so patriarchy is a concept you may have heard us talk about in other of these gatherings if you've been with us before. But we think of patriarchy as social systems where men hold primary power and dominant roles in leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. Now, this includes institutionalized sexism, where men are the dominant group and women are the subjugated group, and norms are established from the perspective of men. And we see some related terms, patriarchal, you might have heard that, or paternalistic. And dominant cultures have historically been patriarchal. And religious texts are not necessarily inherently patriarchal, but rather they reflect the cultural contexts in which they were embedded and interpreted. And so then another term that kind of, rises from this social context and cultural context of patriarchy is this idea of heteronormativity. You may have seen that, term, online. Maybe you've heard it in these meetings before. And heteronormativity is the ways that society, through institutions, norms, practices, and structures of understanding, privileges heterosexuality. And with heteronormativity, heterosexual couples are privileged as the ideal, the thing that we should strive for in sexual and intimate relationships. Now I'm going to pass it off to Gordon to give us some more key concepts to frame our discussion.
Thank you, Wes. I really appreciate that. As we were talking about the various different types of relationships, the key concepts that I'll be covering here are starting with polygamy. And in polygamy, you have polygyny, which is the more predominant one that we see in the Christian culture and in various cultures around that time of the beginning of Christianity. And polygyny is where one man has many wives or female lovers. Some people call them concubines, things of that nature. So they weren't just with one person. The other one that's not as well known and doesn't get mentioned very much is polyandry, which is one woman with many husbands or male lovers. And it's interesting that when a man takes a female lover, they have a word for it, a concubine. And when a woman takes a male lover, it's just kind of blank. So there you have that patristic view coming in. Then monogamy. And so the original concept of monogamy was one partner for life. So lifelong, one partner. But looking at, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, you see how that has evolved into what we now call serial monogamy. So we have one partner until we end that relationship, and then we have another partner, and we don't have anyone else going with them at that time. So monogamy, so we have lifelong or the serial monogamy, and that came up in more modern times. The other concepts I wanted to discuss here are celibacy and chastity. And a lot of times folks get a little confused about that. Celibacy is for someone who abstains from marriage and from sex. So they're not going into relationships for marriage. They're not going into sexual relations with anyone. But chastity means that they're abstaining from all sexual intercourse. And so you may have heard in some of the monastic religious groups that they have vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And so that's where that came into being. And then, speaking of going further down here on our screen, is asceticism or asceticism. So it's religious self-discipline and denial. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the ages, but it's basically people are denying themselves, and it's usually based on their religious beliefs, desire to be more spiritual. And then we look at the more modern concepts of polyamory and consensual non-monogamy. So there we have, with polyamory, we have integrity in multiple relationships. So having more than one intimate relationship. So the practice, desire, or acceptance of having more than one intimate relationship at a time with the knowledge and consent of everyone involved. So it's not like having multiple relationships and keeping it quiet on the side. It's everyone is fully aware and it's ethical. And then we have the expansive polyamory and consensual non-monogamy is going past that heteronormativity that West was talking about earlier. So I'll turn it over to Wes.
Now we're inviting you to a queer approach as we're thinking about this as a kind of a positive disruption. And when we think about a queer approach celebrates diversity, and that's so much of what we do in QCF, recognizing the rich tapestry of human experience across Christian traditions, and also just the richness of how different we all are in the glorious magnificence of God's creation. And so celebrating those differences is a queer approach. And a queer approach also questions categories. We're challenging traditional binary thinking and rigid classifications in theology, in church history, and also in societies and in culture broadly. And then a queer approach can encourage disturbing of norms by examining how cultural assumptions shaped religious practices throughout history. We can create new norms that may reflect our kingdom values and the values of Jesus. And so when we think about relationships across time and cultures, we have to remember that these are not like explicit eras that like there's a starting point and a stopping point. Some of these, kinds of societies may exist at the same time in different places. So in different times and different places, you might see different features of these. And we also don't necessarily like leave aspects of, a different time period behind or a different society behind. We often incorporate some of those values. And so in our, earliest, understanding of social relations, we have the gatherer hunter society. And in those times, small clan and tribal perspectives were dominant, and relationships were more about survival. And non-monogamous practices were definitely featured in those earlier societal forms. And then we move into kind of agricultural society where multi-generational households, emerged as the dominant form, and emphasis on land inheritance, and we see property and patriarchy was definitely a dominant feature in the development of agricultural societies. And then with the Industrial Revolution, we see the kind of urbanization and families forming around nuclear families instead of intergenerational or multi-generational families. And there's definitely new economic pressures, and we see with the rise of capitalism, this is even strengthened more in a variety of ways. And then we're almost familiar with the information age. We see a growing individualism and independence in relationship, and this has a lot to do with, women not necessarily being dependent on men and choosing not to marry. And we also see hookup culture emerging during this time period, and a lot of changes in acceptance of homosexuality and different relationship forms that are kind of created through this individualization as well as independence. And then we are, potentially emerging into this era of Society 5.0, where we have network societies, and the emergence of AI and other technologies raise new questions for us to consider about companionship and relationships and relationship norms. I'm going to turn it over to Gordon now to talk through a little bit of history.
So we can take a little trip here through the clan and tribal perspectives, the agriculturalist, multi-generational households and communities. And this was pretty much where society and cultures were at the time of Jesus, because we're looking at relationships across the history of Christianity. And so there was a large communal focus. So they actually had marriage contracts because they were arranged for property, inheritance, consolidating wealth and power, political strength between families or clans. So marriage wasn't anything that we would think of in our modern concepts. It was a contract. And the early churches disrupted these property-based marriage norms by living in communities. By when they talk about the house church, it wasn't just having church at someone's house. It was people living in community and sharing with each other. During this time, also, polygyny was practiced alongside monogamy. And it was actually the Romans, because of the Greco-Roman culture, brought through contractual marriage for monogamy because they wanted to have more men available to go into the military. So if you had many women dependent on one man, that made it quite an impact, as well as they wanted to control all of that power and wealth. But at this time, they had contractual monogamy on citizens. So if you weren't a citizen, that didn't necessarily apply. But their concept of monogamy was very different. It meant you had one wife, one husband, but they still had concubines, they had orgies, they had sex with slaves, they had mistresses, and everything else. So during this time, they had contractual monogamy, but among non-citizens, polygamy and polygyny were tolerated. In looking at the practices, we also see where the practices had a lot to do in the Christian side with the eschatological expectation. So they encouraged voluntary celibacy and asceticism because at that time they were looking to have Jesus return at any moment. It's imminent. It's not something in the future. It's why should we worry about today, about having wives and husbands and relationships, because Christ is coming again. And I forgot to mention there, and the note is that Paul wrote that church leaders should have one wife So when he speaks of church leaders having only one wife, that definitely infers that there was polygyny among the other clergy people and among some of the folks who were in the community. We're thinking about the eschatological mindset. Celibacy and asceticism started creeping in here because it was mostly for piety and in anticipation of the imminent second coming of Christ. And that was something that was brought over from other cultures also, more than it was from the Christians. Jesus' criticism and critique of this patriarchal treatment of women as property and dependent on men for survival is shown throughout the scriptures. But he was criticizing this whole idea and bringing folks together. Going forward into the looking at the first century, the parallel worship with Jewish believers. So until the destruction of the temple in the year 70, and then the destruction of Jerusalem, the Christians were worshiping right along in the temple with the other Jews. So they just considered themselves still Jewish, but having this devotion to Jesus. But then once the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed, then the Jewish Christians were excluded from all of the synagogues. We talked a little bit about the eschatological mindset. So celibacy and asceticism were voluntary, and they were mostly for piety and anticipation of the parousia, the second coming. But this came about, if you look at the second and third centuries, there's the popularization of Gnosticism. And in Gnosticism, they have this good, evil, black, white, and everything of the spirit and everything that is spiritual is good or sacred, and everything that's material or physical is bad or evil. In addition to that concept coming in, we have an influx of Gentile converts bringing with them the Greco-Roman philosophies. So if you look back and read about all the various Roman philosophers, the Grecian philosophers, and they also felt that you had to have discipline and self-control. And so it's not just over your desires, but it's over your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, your behaviors, and this can even lead to what you ate or drank, what you possessed, as well as trying to keep your sexual desires under control. Because again, remember, spirit good, physical bad. Going into the 4th century, we see that the church is starting to ask about sexual abstinence for priests before and during the rituals and the rites. And this actually is a holdover from Jewish ritual purity, and including the influence of the Greco-Roman philosophies. So knowing where we came from a history coming out of Judaism, that helped influence all of the ritual purity through there. Moving forward from there, we're going to jump up and look at some of the medieval shifts from the 7th to 11th centuries. Now, in the 7th century, we had records from France even indicating the majority of priests were still married, even though they were saying you need to refrain. Okay, but we're still married. In the 10th century, the First and Second Lateran councils, which were in 1123 and 1139, they prescribed celibacy for priests. So in other words, they're saying you need to be celibate. They weren't saying chaste. They weren't saying you can stay married and just have ritual purity when you're performing the rituals. You need to be celibate. And in the 11th century, Gregorian reform prescribed priestly separation. If they were married, they had to separate from their wives. The wife of the priest had to perform penance, and their offspring were declared bastards. And so during this period, church authorities increasingly regulated relationships. They tried to regulate the average person, but they really came down on the clergy and all the religious leaders. Moving forward into the 12th century, we get into some of the Reformation area. And this is where we start to see an emergence of a concept of love. So if you think of courtly love, those traditions, reshaping the reference to relationships, in the midst of that, it's not quite like the romantic love that we'll see later on come up. It is something more akin to this flowery, romantic type of thing, the chivalry. And so it wasn't just a contract anymore. In the 15th century, we still had reports that even though priests are not to have wives or children, up to 50% of them remain married despite the regulations. And then in the 16th century, in the 1500s, is when we start seeing the Protestant Reformation. And they brought about the declaration that marriage is a natural state, and they disavow celibacy for clergy. As a matter of fact, Martin Luther wrote, basically, I confess that I cannot forbid a person to marry several wives because it is not contraindicated in the scripture. So when you've got the leader of this movement saying, I can't forbid someone to marry several wives, although he wasn't a great proponent of polygamy or polygyny, as this would be, he did state that he couldn't find anything in the scriptures to prohibit it. The Roman Catholics doubled down and decided they were still going to enforce celibacy for clergy. So moving forward from the Reformation era brings us up to the Industrial Revolution and rise of the nuclear family in the 18th century. So we see the influence of Romanticism, the concept of love-based relationships. So prior to this, it was contractual. It was not uncommon for people who were 12 and 13 and 14 years old to not just become betrothed under the contractual, but to actually be married at that time. And the concept was, well, you will grow to like each other. But now we see Romanticism coming in the 18th century, where people are deciding, oh, hey, I want to be with someone that I'm in love with. I don't want to grow in love with them afterwards. I want to be in love before we make any of those commitments. And the Industrial Revolution brought about the changes in family structure and economics. So we see there the rise of the nuclear family. So as opposed to being multi-generational under one roof or living together in close proximity, now we get a nuclear family. And that change in family structure and economics actually increased stress on a couple because now they have to fulfill all of the roles previously performed by a whole group of family networks. From there, we go on into the information age and individualization. And I'm going to turn this over to Wes.
Thank you. Yeah, there are so many changes, and as we discussed as we were planning this, there are so many things that we're not talking about here, and we're just hitting on some of the highlights, and encourage you all to do your own deeper research and thinking through some of these shifts. But in many of our lifetimes, we've seen significant changes in the information age, not just with the rise of individualization, but also with the publication and the press and the kind of creating of these imagined communities that cross larger spaces and are able to share ideas through broadcast and print, and all of the ways that information and our societies became connected through these different forms of information. And many adaptations within the church, we already saw with the Reformation. And so there's this, pressure, and the Vatican II created a marriage option for permanent deacons, which was a huge shift. And then shifting marriage concepts. Gordon already mentioned this idea of, like post 1960s, monogamy becomes one marriage at a time, considering that serial monogamy, some people actually consider serial monogamy kind of a type of polygamy. It's just serial instead of, you still have many partners. You just don't have them at the same time. And so I think it's really interesting. It's not necessarily polyamory because you're not having multiple loves at the same time, but those lines are definitely, when we think about these categories, right? Where do we draw these lines? How do we decide what's in a category and what's not in a category? And so we definitely see there's, less need for these lifelong commitments. Women earning power and so many opportunities that change the kind of need for the protection, and also the rise of feminism kind of resisting the patriarchy and resisting those kinds of ways of being in the world. And of course, there's the kind of conservative reaction with the rise of the moral majority that emerges in response to many of these societal changes. And with the rise of individualism, we also see this idea of personal fulfillment kind of becoming magnified, as we talked about, like courtly love, and then we have romanticism, and this rise of individualism is it's about my pleasure. And we see that in many of the relationship forms, and hookup culture, and those kinds of things. So it's a time that many of you are probably more familiar with, and seeing some of these changes. And we're moving on. We're at this place where some sociologists and other theorists are imagining that we're actually shifting quite a bit, moving from just the information age to this networked society age. And there's a significant aspect of deconstructionism, as if you're in one place and you're networked with another place, it has different norms, right? It gives you the opportunity to kind of examine and to question the norms of your own society. But within these, massive shifts that we've been experiencing, there's unprecedented polarization. We see queer unions, gay marriage, women's ordination, they're expanded alongside conservative movements like Christian nationalism and the rise of the trad wife. And there's the Vatican statement. We just, saw this amazing, blessing of same-sex couples at the same time, denouncing of gender theory, and and valorizing marriage between a man and a woman, and clearly male and female, kind of prioritizing that. And then new technologies, the development of artificial intelligence, and chatbots that are becoming therapeutic companions, but also romantic companions. We have extended reality and virtual reality, this virtual reality and augmented reality, all of these ways that like relationships are being kind of augmented or extended beyond what we might have experienced in the past. And there's even someone who's married a robot in China already. And so marriage with a robot has happened in our lifetime and in our world. And these changes and these shifts in understanding, like, what does it mean to be in a relationship? What does it mean to be married? What does it mean to have a companion? That, maybe even harken back to some of like what Gordon was talking about with this Gnosticism, right? Like, okay, is it material? Is it physical? Is it emotional? Is it spiritual? Or is it all just sexual? We were raising a lot of questions about the nature of relationships, and so we're in this space where we have to think about relationships as we move into the future of what's next. How do we ground our values in our own experience of faith and our faith commitments? And I think it's really important for us to kind of take these changes and this kind of view of history, and how there isn't just like one way that's always been the right way, as we move forward and we think about what will promote the flourishing of humanity in society and culture, and especially in our community at QCF. So, what's next? How do we think about these things? This is very relevant for us today, especially as we're in these times of major change. And as we noted, this increasing polarization. How do we look at church history and connect it to our own experiences and values? And this is where we're offering, again, a queer approach, or we might say a queer lens, right? What can we learn from ourselves and our queer siblings about the freedom that may come from disrupting normative culture? And we see that in the early church and the communal, house churches, right, in the communities that were disturbing the norms of that time. And we can see that throughout many of these different, changes, and whether it's a regulation or a resistance to a norm, that there are ways that disrupting normative culture is a very Christian thing to do, and has been historically a very Christian thing to do. And a queer approach allows us to see beyond categories, to celebrate differences and diversity. And I hope and I invite you all to kind of take on that lens. And a queer approach helps us to see and question social categories and these cultural assumptions that we may have previously thought and assumed were the way it should be. And as we see that, the way it should be is a very complicated thing to imagine, and to imagine that we would know God's intentions, and to to think that this is what God says, I think raises a lot of questions for us to think about. What are our values, and what does God want for our future? And a queer approach empowers us to disturb cultural and societal norms that are in opposition to the values of community that we know Jesus and Jesus' people hold as key and central to what it means to be a Christian. Now, you don't have to be queer to adopt a queer lens through which to view the world. And so we invite you to consider these things, and how all of this might be relevant to you today.
I think one of the things that going through this presentation really drives home is that those things that we thought were, quote, the norm weren't, and that it's really very fluid. Even when the powers that be try to clamp down on things, you know, um, humanity rises above that. We seep through as human beings. You know, that's kind of where I see that from. And things have been in flux for a long time. It's just that who gets to write the history is the big question, and what viewpoint are they espousing? And Wes, do you have any thoughts on how
Yeah.
that's going?
Yeah, I mean, you just lobbed it right into where I was thinking. These ideas, to me, one of the biggest kind of facts is patriarchy
Mm,
and how so much of what we were told and how the Bible and various religious texts were interpreted was through the lens of patriarchy, predominantly by men over centuries. And if you read feminist theology and feminist perspectives, we see a lot of different conclusions that are drawn from the same texts, by amazing scholars. I'm thinking of, I think Phyllis Tribble is one that really reinterprets kind of the creation narrative. So I think, you know, taking comfort, right? It gives you a little bit of security to be able to say, oh, it's not inherently in the text, that this is the way it should be. However, that there are things that we can learn from these texts. And one of the things that Hebrew scholar Phyllis Tribble kind of brings out this point in the thinking about Adam and Eve, and the male headship that is so often resting upon that Adam was created first, is disturbed by this notion that the first human that was created embodied male and female, masculine and feminine, and all the things in between, the fullness of, being created in the image of God. And so it wasn't that like Eve was an afterthought or a subordinate or any of those kinds of things. It's more this idea of this multiplicity of God, that God is not just, this one singular thing. And then, thinking further beyond that, a lot of our kind of insistence that marriage is between a man and a woman, because this narrative says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and therefore it is our mandate to have these heterosexual reproductive relationships. One of my questions is, well, how do we know when the earth is full,
right.
and what kinds of relationships are going to emerge when the earth has become full? And I think we're seeing a lot of these changes because we may be, coming to that point where that mandate is no longer like, this is how we need to structure relationships, because of this historic thing that has a whole different context than where we're at today.
I think this is one of those things that we just wrestle with over and over and over again because most of us didn't grow up learning that we had a lens that we were looking at something through. And so to see the lens is a step within itself. And then to realize how many lenses, my photography background, how many lenses are in this single device. It's just like, oh, for it to even make sense, it's gone through so many layers of predetermined, pre-shaped, pre-worked out things that once you start to rearrange them, you're like, oh, it doesn't always have to be a narrow focus. It could be a very wide focus. And then the other thing I love that you said, Wes, of I don't think I've ever encountered that question. What do we do when the earth is full? Like, what
Mm,
does relationship and dynamic? Because I've heard some awkward conversations about there is no marriage and giving a hand in marriage in heaven, which
mm,
again presents us this idea of how if we make so much of an importance on the marriage relationship now, what does it look like to be in connection when all of that melts away, at least from some of the interpretations that we have about what heaven is like? So, oh, so good.
Well,
And
and
there's some, yeah, go ahead, go.
that's the kingdom, right? Like if we think
Hmm.
of, we are community, we're kin, and what do those kinship relationships look like? It really kind of changes the conversation if we're looking forward instead of looking back for how we should be in relationship.
For sure, for sure. There's some good conversation also happening in the chat when it comes to representation, when it comes to how we see each other and how we see these things. We know that many queer and gender diverse individuals have been erased as a result of colonial history. We're looking at what's happening right now in the United States. What thoughts come up when it comes to how do we model, how do we see, how do we continue to understand our relationship dynamics? That's a big, messy, hairy question. So go for what you want.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. I mean, first of all, I'm showing up here, and I am in an open marriage. And when I teach at the University of Washington, I know it's not a Christian context. So, but even so, right, being out as a queer poly person, standing up in front of, 270 students each quarter, it's challenging, especially now with so many regulations and expectations on public education, because I'm at a public university. And I hear what you're saying about like fear. Like a lot of times there is this fear, and I am certainly in a position of privilege, and I acknowledge that I'm in a position of privilege to be able to put myself out there, and to like I just sat in on, we had a lawyer come and talk to our faculty about like academic freedom and what does that mean. And because my research is in the area of, I did my dissertation on LGBTQ plus Christians and their use of dating apps, right? It's totally within my domain to be able to teach about these things. Like I actually, in a course I did on internet dating, I actually teach about polyamory. There's some great academic papers about it that I can have my students read. And so, that's kind of one way, right, to be able to put it out there. And I'm also teaching about religious stuff. So some students, might be, breadcrumbing their way in. But I agree with some of the commentary in the chat here that, Q Christian Fellowship is definitely becoming a place where we can have these conversations. We can be visibly, openly, all the glorious goodness that we are, and celebrate that and celebrate our loves and our joys, and our struggles and our the various relationship diversities that we have. In my kind of my academic work, I talk about gender, sexual, and relationship diversities to kind of dislocate it from this identity politics thing. We're talking about the ways that we live and express our lives, and the ways that we are in the world. And so being able to freely like live into those diversities and celebrate those diversities is really important to me. That was a long answer. Gordon, go ahead.
But I love what you said. You packed a lot into that. Um, so how do we live into this? Um, wow. I mean, I have been trying to live into this and doing my best to be an open queer clergy person for several decades now. And in the last 2 decades, open about my polyamory. And also realizing that as a cis male Northern European descent, there is a bit of privilege that's there, but I am hoping to be able to stand up and to say, not everyone is going to put everybody else down, that I'm here to represent, It's like, how many other bishops do you know in any church that are going to stand up and say that? I know a couple. Myself now, but to be able to just live into it, you know, and to allow people to see that and to grow from that and to bring them along, not to say, oh, I can do it, but you need to find your own way. No, no, no. But to be community, to be supportive, and to realize, hey, we don't have the answers. We make mistakes. We back up. We try again. You know, that is the way of it. And hopefully going forward, we will be able to support and grow with each other in whatever ways we need to grow, because it's not just all, it's like I tell folks, they say, well, what about all these other religions and things? And I say, well, You talking denominations or what? I kind of look at it like we're all on the same road, just some people are driving Hondas and some people are driving Chevys, and you know, somebody's on a motorbike and somebody else is driving this big old bus because they got a boatload of people with them, you know, and we all get along together is the big thing. The most difficult thing is to deal with some of the people who are so close-minded and who believe that the Adam and the Genesis story is the only way that it can be. It's really that is a huge challenge, especially if you live in an area that's very conservative. So we try and support each other. We try and help each other figure out what's going on next. Where am I? Where do I need to be? And
Hmm.
I really love what Wes was saying about, okay, so when the earth is full, A, who determines it's full? But I mean, I think we're feeling that. And so then what? Because we're not just going to all go out and procreate.
The definitions we share here are relative in that they help us differentiate how we're talking about a particular topic. But it's
Right.
certainly worth acknowledging that one, this is very Western, very US. We have our own individual experiences and denominations and so forth. Like even for me, in my own Catholic, not old Catholic, but Roman Catholic tradition, um, uh, chastity would just be about how you steward your sexuality. So a married person should also be chaste in that tradition, as opposed to it, having some of the other complications. But then in my evangelical church, it was as a gay person, I'm supposed to abstain from relationships and sex. But a friend got kicked out of his ministry position because he went to the movies with another man. And somehow in their definition, he had violated the sex and relationship rule. So it isn't to say there are no meanings. It's just to say, yes, there are a lot of definitions and a lot of understandings that come dragged along into this, and we do want to acknowledge that we don't have every understanding available. Did anybody want to add to that? I know it's a complete answer.
I was, yeah, I appreciate you adding into it because my basic thing was the definitions that we gave at the beginning. I guess we should have said, for the purposes of this discussion, this is how we are defining these terms. So that would have made it a little bit more clear. And that there are other realms, like you said. There are other definitions of those, depending on the circumstances, the culture, the historical background, all of
The
that.
tradition,
Yeah.
because, when we think about celibacy, right? It might be different within Catholic tradition,
Mhm.
within Protestant traditions, and very there's so much variation across cultures and across religious traditions as well as thinking about celibacy from a secular perspective, right? That's a whole nother question.
Absolutely. I'm looking for of course, I remember the way my brain works, I remember stories, not dates and names.
Okay.
And one of the things that really comes up for me as we think about celibacy in this context is that there was a shift in the church of at one point celibacy was the highest good for one relationally. And then the person who is often attributed with saying celibacy and marriage should be on the same plane was deemed a heretic the time that he said it. Whereas in contrast, today we have celibacy often elevated. I'm sorry, we have marriage elevated above celibacy. And many churches today do not have any formal, institutional, budgetary way that they're supporting people who are either called to celibacy or have been
Mhm.
mandated by the rules of that church.
Right.
So for me, when I think about celibacy, I also think about how the same power structures that sometimes are calling people or suggesting that people should be living into this also don't tangibly support the ideals. And that was my experience in the church I was formerly a part of, where when I went to them and they told me, this is what we expect of you, I asked, well, I was in a church that had published books, had lots of videos, did 20,000 person conferences. But when I asked about the resource that they were asking me to commit the rest of my life to, they were like, yeah, if you find any, could you tell us? I was shocked. But it's something that I see so often in churches where we do inherit lots of words and language and ideals, but where
Mhm.
we haven't dug in deep to understand what our values are or how we are expecting our community to live that out. But that's me talking a lot. Did else have something to add?
I was going to say that just goes right back into history when the church said that the priests need to be celibate and they need to separate from their wives. And then they didn't provide anything for the wives. They told them you have to do penance, right? But
Hmm.
how is she going to eat? And how are the kids going to, you know, do anything?
Right.
They're declared bastards. It's like, say what? So it was fine until you declared this, and now no, no, yeah.
Yeah.
So giving those types of things without looking at who it impacts, and it's like any relationship. Whatever you do, you have to see who it interacts with and who it impacts and what's happening, more than just,
Absolutely.
oh, okay, do this.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely.